Alright guys, this is the second part of our seminar on Yoga of Higher Love. Now let's try to look at Yoga of Higher Love from a standpoint of Yoga Axiomatics, which includes the fundamental axioms and principles that make up the foundation of the elegant building of self-exploration. Let me remind you that yoga is a system of self-exploration. Let's start from the very beginning. The main idea of yoga is freedom, an extremely abstract and incomprehensible word. Here I'd like to emphasize something right away. It is related to the practical study of both the axiomatics and methods emerging from it. Nobody has the right to impose anything on you. Any yoga is just a set of recommendations that you can either apply in your universe or reject. The same is true for the Triad, which includes Yoga of the Union, Tantra Yoga, and Yoga of Higher Love. You can either follow this path, and no doubt it will get you to the final goal very fast, or you can choose something else. For example, maybe you don't want to practice the Triad. Instead, you want to practice Hatha and Kundalini Yoga only, for instance. Or you can say there will be no longer higher love whatsoever in your life. Of course, with such a decision, you won't be able to dismiss higher love altogether. However, on the other hand, there will be no abuse in your life either. Therefore, all the methods of the Triad, primarily Yoga of Higher Love, because we are talking about it today, apply to all yogis and yoginis who first have set their life goals to reach the highest, and second, follow the path of the Triad and practice Yoga of the Union, Tantra Yoga, and Yoga of Higher Love. These three kinds of yoga are inseparable, at least in our yoga school. If you feel that this path is not for you, you can take a note of it, keep it in mind, and go a different yoga direction. Finally, when it comes to people who are not interested in self-exploration whatsoever, who live in an ordinary social environment with all of its faults and who couldn't care less about higher level spiritual heights, we are not going to discuss how they live and what they do. Why? Because they are free beings. They live the way they wish to live. Therefore, theoretically, we could take a look at every case of higher love that has ever happened to anyone who lives in our society. However, it is a very difficult and pointless thing to do, because we would be trying to make people fit into laws they have never wished to live according to. It goes without saying that the highest laws are the same for everyone. At the same time, the law of free will is more important, which leads to a tricky situation. Guys, each of us lives in the universe we have chosen to live in. If you choose not to live in the universe of the Triad, you will live as if no such yoga existed for you at all. You get it, right? It is the same analogy with the Absolute. The Absolute comes into our lives only after we have expressed our will to invite it. into our inner universe. If there is no place for such phenomenon as the absolute in one's life, then the absolute does not impose itself. However, it does not disappear either. The same is true for both Yoga of Higher Love and the Triad. Unfortunately, quite often I hear of ordinary people who are not only uninterested in yoga, but who do everything the other way around in ways that don't correspond with yoga. It is impossible to interpret their lives. They are free universes. That's it. The reason why I mention this is that sometimes I hear people say, "We don't want any yoga of higher love, period. Let it not be." As soon as one says, "I don't want yoga of higher love," all arguments and reasons become pointless. No one will have any intention to prove anything to anyone. Why? Because in these subtle spheres, either a person accepts this system of views or doesn't. By trying to prove something, we start imposing and suppressing someone else's will. No one, especially if it comes to yoga, will have a desire to deal with it. Therefore, it is important to understand that the fact that not all people accept and practice this type of yoga does not mean such yoga doesn't exist. If they don't see yoga of higher love in their own lives, full of disappointments, failures, and endless chasing of chimerical hopes, it doesn't mean this kind of yoga doesn't exist. It only means that these people have expressed their will not to encounter it. And it is clear that no one will be interested in investigating why higher love doesn't manifest itself in their lives. How can I figure out why higher love or the absolute hasn't come into someone's life if that person expressed his will not to come across it? It is pointless to discuss the rest. This is a fine line that excludes all kinds of theosophic metaphysical debates on what higher love is. The subject itself is transcendent. There is no point in arguing about something that is beyond words and thoughts. It will be a trivial conversation between a deaf person and a dumb person. Anyhow, let's get back to the axiomatics of yoga. Let me remind you that the yoga system is based on the axiomatic principles. There are two systems of axioms: the macrocosm and microcosm systems. They both speak about the same thing, our reality and ourselves, but from different perspectives. These two systems gives us a logical justification. I'd like to stress the word justification. I don't say explanation. Of all yoga practices. Why? Our mind is like a small child who is always crying and who needs a pacifier. Our mind needs logical explanations. In the case of yoga of higher love, our mind needs logical explanation for why this type of yoga has the right to exist. And we have to give him a pacifier in the form of concepts, axioms, theorems, and logical cohesive sequences to make our minds mad screaming about how everything is bad and illogical calm down. Why? Because such an overly active mind destroys higher love very quickly when higher love comes. Such a mind is like a surgeon's scalpel that tries to dissect everything not taking into consideration that it is impossible to cut a person into 50,000 pieces and keep him alive. The same is true for higher love. Sometimes it is dangerous to pit our mind against higher love that has just manifested itself. When higher love appears in our life as a gift, we pit our mind against it just because our mind is unfamiliar with it. That is why, on one hand, our mind has to be satisfied. And at the same time, nothing should contradict it, because supreme logic never contradicts logic. Logic is only a particular case of supreme logic. On the other hand, it is necessary to calm our mind down, because our mind is our biggest helper. However, at some point of our evolutionary development, our mind turns into our most dangerous enemy. Therefore, it is necessary to learn how to turn it off. Turning our mind off is like throwing a bone to a dog. The dog immediately forgets about barking at the neighbors while chewing the bone. This doesn't mean at all that higher love can be explained from the standpoint of axiomatic logic. No, higher love cannot be explained from the standpoint of axioms. But it is possible to explain to a certain extent those exercises of yoga of higher love that directly or indirectly get us closer to the level of supreme logic or higher love. Let's begin. Each of us is a free self, a part of the Absolute. Let me remind you that the process of the universe's creation occurred in specific stages. Each stage is called a law and has a number. It all started with law 0, the law of the non-manifested Absolute. There was no one and nothing, not even a future young man and young girl who would fall in love with each other. Again, the word was is also not quite correct, because at that time there was no such thing as time. It is an extremely abstract and elusive state, the state of law 0, when the Absolute stayed in its non-manifested form. Then, according to the yoga axiomatics, the Absolute expressed its will to manifest itself. It manifested itself, as the yoga axiomatics teaches, as prana. From that moment on, we can talk about the single absolute, law 1. Simultaneously, even though there was no time, we can say that the absolute existed in law 0 as well. In other words, it simultaneously existed in both law 0 and law 1, the law of the manifested absolute. It manifested itself as prana. Then prana got divided into two parts, consciousness and energy. Thus, the absolute divided itself, although in this case the word divided has more of a figurative meaning, according to the principle of eternal modification of oneself, which is energy, and the principle of eternal permanence of oneself, which is consciousness. From that moment, we can talk about law 2. However, at the same time, both law 0 and law 1 were still being implemented. In other words, the absolute simultaneously existed in those three states: in its non-manifested state, in the state when it manifested itself as prana, and in the state when it manifested itself as both male and female principles, or as they like to say in India, as Shiva and Shakti. Law 2 is when we can start talking about higher love. Why? Because from the standpoint of our usual understanding, there should be someone to be in love with. During the universe's creation, it became possible to fall in love with someone only after the Absolute divided itself into two parts. That being said, the state of higher love refers to law 2, when there is one and the other. And the best part of Yoga of Higher Love is that higher love makes a single out of these two people. It returns people who are in love back to law 1. The level of law 1 is something that gets us closer to the state of Yoga of Higher Love very quickly. Law 1 is also called Samadhi with an object. After that, we rise even higher to the level of law 0, the level of Samadhi without an object. However, this doesn't mean that someone disappears. It means that the level of abstraction and the degree of elevation that come with this state have surpassed all the limits we can describe using words or thoughts. Thus, higher love begins from the level of law 2. After law 2, as we remember from the Axiomatics, comes the level of law 4 and 5. This is when the single consciousness appeared as 4 facets and the single energy appeared as 5 facets. The level of law 4 and 5 is the level of love. Why? Because there is a choice. Someone who is in love has no choice. There is only one person in the whole world that exists for him. They look at each other and they are in love. They merge into a single and reach the level of law 1. The level of law 4 and 5, however, implies that there can be a range of interests. If we analyze the triad from this point of view, we get the following. The first stage of Yoga of Higher Love is when we suddenly rise with a powerful surge to the level of law 1 and 1. However, over time, we descend to law 4 and 5 again. In other words, we reach the level of law 1 and 1 during the first stage of higher love. Then, when we get back to the level of law 4 and 5, we call it the second stage of Yoga of Higher Love. When the third stage of Yoga of Higher Love comes, first we get to the level of law 1 and 1 again, then we reach law 1. Finally, we rise to the level of law 0 and leave this universe. This is what we have if we analyze Yoga of Higher Love from the standpoint of Yoga Axiomatics. Thus, we can see the correlation between each state of yoga of higher love and the levels of the fundamental laws that created our universe. When we are at the level of law 4 and 5, we can be drawn simultaneously to several people. A man can love several women, or a woman can love several men at once. Someone we love more, someone we love less. However, these several women a man is drawn to are actually not several women, but different facets of the one woman he would fall in love with instantly. The man finds everything he needs in these several women to get closer to the state of the level of law 1 and 1. Because we live at the level of law 4 and 5, the universe begins to compensate for law 1 and 1 when we are in love. Law 4 and 5 is the level when our leapfrog between attachments and attractions to different partners comes into play. We discussed this in detail when we were talking about Tantra Yoga and Yoga of the Union. The leapfrog of our sympathies and attachments to one person, then to somebody else, is a compensation for not being at the level of law 1 and 1. This is what all the practices of both Tantra Yoga and Yoga of the Union are rooted in. When a yogi or yogini can have additional partners besides the main partner, a husband or wife, to practice with, to gain the missing facets, as well as to do everything they can to meet this necessary but insufficient condition to reach law 1 and 1. All the numerous practices of both Tantra Yoga and Yoga of the Union are not a whim at all. These practices are not a rampancy of the followers' erotic fantasies. They are a vital necessity. As far as you are aware, all the practices of both Tantra Yoga and Yoga of the Union at the level of law 4 and 5 become useless and meaningless as soon as a person rises to the level of law 1 and 1 when he falls in love. Therefore, all the practices with multiple partners other than your husband or wife are simply not needed when you are in love with your husband or wife. But here you have to be honest with yourself. You can call anything you want higher love. But it is a good idea to check on yourself from time to time and make sure that you are really as in love as you're trying to convince yourself, or you are just misleading yourself. Remember that this state of higher love doesn't have the word if. If someone is in love, there can be no demands or claims addressed to the object of higher love. There cannot be any sort of discomfort from the object of higher love at all. Why? Because the very concept of higher love implies that you reach the level of law one and one, and there is no one else besides the object of your higher love. There is no one to compare with. There is just one, and this one has it all. If you say, oh, something is missing, it means you are not at the level of law one and one, the level of higher love. This is just love. You can love one person for some qualities, another person for other qualities, and so on. The proportions can differ, but this is not higher love. In the state of higher love, a man can only think about one woman, and not about 5 Tantra Yoga or Yoga of the Union partners. Only about one. The same is true for a woman. She cannot think about 4 partners in the state of higher love. She can think about only one. Another thing is that sometimes we lie to ourselves. The question is whether it is appropriate or not. If you don't follow the path of the Triad, please do anything you want. However, if you choose to practice the Triad, you should know that lying won't do any good. Or rather, it will bring suffering and disappointment into your life. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse if you live in the world where this law exists. Ignorance of traffic rules and regulations is not an excuse when getting behind the wheel. It won't save you from a ticket. However, if you don't want to deal with it, you can always walk. The same is true for the Triad. We remember that this fast method of spiritual development involves the habit of being honest with yourself and analyzing all your motivations and actions. If you're not ready to be honest with yourself, there is no need to drive the fast racing cars of the Triad. Instead, you can choose the quiet walking paths of other known kinds of yoga. There are a lot of them. They are amazing and wonderful. Moreover, taking a walk and getting some fresh air can be very beneficial for your health. Plus, it's super good for your complexion. I hope my analogy is clear for you. It doesn't mean that we should throw everyone in the same barrel and make them practice the Triad. It doesn't mean everyone has to practice Tantra Yoga, Yoga of the Union, or Yoga of Higher Love. Not at all. These kinds of yoga are only for those who have chosen to follow this path and drive this fast vehicle. But let me get back to our topic. It turns out that the state of higher love is the state when there is only a subject, an object, and the process of higher love. In other words, all your thoughts, emotions, and intentions are pointed towards the one you are in love with. However, out of habit, you still have a perception of yourself. But if you reach the level where the mere thought of the object you are in love with causes an overwhelming euphoria, you begin to forget about yourself in favor of the object you are in love with. Indeed, in the highest state of love, a young man doesn't remember about himself. He thinks about a girl. He is ready to knock the world flat and give up his life for the love of that girl. He doesn't think about the danger of death. There is nothing he is afraid of when he thinks about the girl. He couldn't care less about his death. There is only one intention. Thus, the young man, even if he has karma in the form of self-preservation law or some other concept about himself, begins to pay less attention to his manifestations and eventually forgets about them. Why? Because all his aspiration is pointed towards the girl. And if he starts forgetting about them, then all these concepts generated by the false self-perception, all these layers start easily peeling off him. After all, he, as well as the young girl, is a part of the Absolute. We all are made the same way. We all are parts of the Absolute. Forgetting about himself, he peels away everything that bothers him, including his karma that eventually would make him lose this higher love in the future. Thus, forgetting about himself and thinking about her, he merges with her and reaches the level of law 1. This is the most supreme kind of yoga and the highest meditation, if I may. What processes take place when we are in love? We know that we can manifest ourselves in different ways. We breathe, we can jump, run, and see. Our bodies are made in a certain way. We also have our causal and subtle bodies. There are as many different types of yoga as there are manifestations of human life. In the state of higher love, all kinds of yoga take place in a person simultaneously and naturally. No effort is needed. Why? Because all our inner moving parts and cogs adjust to the impulse of the highest. Let's take breathing, for instance. The breathing pattern of someone who is in love changes. As a result, such a person naturally approaches the principles of pranayama yoga. Another example is when we practice poses or asanas to eventually start working with our central channel. Our spine should be aligned and stable, so we hold a pose for a long time. When a young man thinks about his girl, he involuntarily straightens his spine. Oh, my beautiful Juliet. Any type of yoga that we can possibly name will take place in a person who is in love. Tantra Yoga uses our ability to see. It is clear that a picture or portrait of his beloved girl will be the most powerful yantra for such a man. He can look at it for hours without blinking. No yogi can even dream of that. He will also keep seeing her in dreams while sleeping. Or let's take mantra yoga. One chants a mantra and immerses in it. The sweet name of his girl will be the mantra for such a man. He is ready to sing it. Do you know those Hindu chantings that never end, although they're a bit drooling to my taste? The young man will keep repeating the name of his girl in all sharp and flat notes. experiencing the sweetness of it. The same is true for all types of yoga. Karma yoga teaches us to work without expecting a reward, as well as with no fear of a punishment. It teaches us to work with no attachments. Someone who is in love works like a machine in a way, automatically. He doesn't care if someone praises or scolds him. Why? Because mentally he is not at work. Mentally he is with the object of his higher love. Thus, every single type of yoga begins to work in this sort of implicit manner when someone is in the state of higher love. That being said, you can easily guess that some kinds of yoga were written off from the state of higher love. In other words, you may notice that you have a certain breath pattern when you are in the state of higher love. Your physical body also reacts in a particular way that is extremely beneficial for you. Such observations turn into a set of rules and exercises for other people who have not experienced higher love yet. A person who practices such artificial methods reproduces the reactions of his body as if he was in love, except he is not in the state of higher love. Thus, we get multiple yoga practices. Within time, these practices get forgotten. The teachers of yoga get dissolved in the universe. The practices keep getting passed down from generation to generation, often by people who were never in love, and this is how it starts. First, someone made something up in the 16th century, then someone else added a few words in the 17th century. In the 18th century, people decided that the interpretation of the practice should be completely different. The practices get distorted. This is very typical for yoga. Therefore, yoga is considered to disappear. Yes, the exercises are good. However, only a few people understand where they came from and what principles they were driven from. From a formal point of view, when in love, you willingly or unwillingly practice all conceivable and inconceivable kinds of yoga. Let's take dream yoga for instance. What dreams do you think the young man will have when he falls asleep? I doubt he will have dreams about his job. Thus, all the karmic impurities that hindered this state of yoga disappear. To sum up, you can either follow this direct way or take a detour practicing other types of yoga. Here's my favorite example. Imagine that you are a Maharaja or a Rani, Maharaja's wife. You have a palace, but you didn't know about it for a long time. There is a grand entrance that brings you to the palace. This entrance is beautiful. It is decorated with gold and flowers. There are multiple back entrances as well that lead to the same palace. What are they for? They are for provision, to let the servants in, or for other household needs. It turns out that we can enter the palace and sit on the throne, or to get to know our higher self or the universe, using different entrances. You can either triumphantly walk up the grand staircase or you can use one of the back entrances. The multiple types of yoga that works specifically with a certain ability of ours, such as the ability to see, hear, talk, and so on, are the multiple back doors of the palace. Yoga of higher love is the grand entrance. However, even a Raja prefers to use one of the back entrances from time to time. It is worse when having an opportunity to use the grand entrance, we start to thievishly make our way through the back entrances. Usually, I make a joke about a yogi who has good enough karma to reach the final goal and take a seat on the throne. On the other hand, his karma is bad enough to do it. Why? Maybe he had been a rogue or a burglar for his past few lives. There is no way he can use the grand entrance. He always needs to break something or tunnel his way under a wall. He simply cannot act differently. The same is true for the multiple types of yoga we know of today. Some of them are quite difficult to understand and practice. I believe I've mentioned several times the practice of meditating at a cemetery. When a practitioner coats himself with the ash left after dead bodies are burned. It is even better if you sit on some skulls. They say it helps a lot with concentrating. These are real types of yoga. They work extremely well under certain conditions for people with certain personalities, ways of thinking, karma, or whatever you want to call it. Clearly, the goal of yoga is not to bring everyone to a cemetery to find skulls to sit on coated in ash. However, sometimes it works better than anything. This is pretty much what we see with other kinds of yoga, including Hatha yoga. Hatha yoga is the most necessary type of yoga. We cannot make it without Hatha yoga. Everyone who screams at every corner that they have learned everything Hatha yoga has to offer, that they no longer need it and already practice Raja yoga and meditations, such people are liars. It is essential to keep the physical body in good shape. You have to take care of your body while you have it. But on the other hand, there is another way to keep your body in shape. The Triad unites yoga of the union, yoga of higher love, and Tantra Yoga for a reason. Why? Because if you fall in love with a girl and keep thinking about her, then sooner or later you will find yourself in bed with her having sex. What's wrong with that? Nothing. Everything is wonderful. It turns out there are techniques used in yoga of the union that compensate for hatha yoga. This is what yoga of the union is built on. However, it is a big question whether we will be able to keep up with the intensity of the exercises yoga of the union offers. That is why first we have to practice hatha yoga for a long time to be able to handle at least the shortest marathon in bed. You get the point, right? All other types of yoga are just crutches we use until we learn how to walk. I keep talking about Kundalini yoga, which is very popular in the West today. This type of yoga is a part of a tantric knowledge. It includes serious practices that allow us to awaken our internal energy located at the base of our body and connected with our consciousness at the top of our heads. It is higher love within your body. The same happens when a young man thinks about a girl he's in love with, and the girl thinks about the young man she's in love with. The very thought of having an object of higher love causes euphoria, which is more than enough. All other energies, consciousnesses, and gears begin to move by themselves. The only thing you need is just this state. When a person awakens Kundalini energy, it begins rushing up towards the consciousness at the top of his head, like a girl running on a date with a young man she is in love with. This is true Kundalini yoga. In other words, whatever happens at the moment of higher love naturally The same happens in your body on the level of your energy and your consciousness. It is the principle of correspondence. Similar to a young man and a young girl who are in love with each other, your consciousness and your energy are in love with each other as well. When you are in love, the processes of Kundalini Yoga start taking place inside of you safely and naturally. That being said, you don't need to torture yourself by doing some terrifying practices to awaken this energy and bring it to the top of your head. You don't need to apply the truly monumental efforts described in many ancient texts. It is enough to be in the state of higher love. The energy will begin naturally rising up, and you will be safely enjoying it. Meanwhile, Kundalini Yoga is full of various warnings and precautions for practitioners. God forbid to do that. Otherwise, you will be torn into small pieces. If you do this, it will be even worse. You had better to do the previous one. The whole Kundalini Yoga has the same scenario. However, I'm not saying such a scenario is useless, and I'm not saying we don't need it. Some people have never experienced higher love. They already have this intention to get to know the highest, but they haven't received this gift in this nor in the previous lives. It might be a solution for someone like that man who had been robbing places for the last 5 lives. He became a Maharaja in this life, but it is still easier for him to take a seat on his throne by entering the palace using a back door rather than going through a grand entrance. That is why it is unreasonable to make categorical statements saying that we have to use a certain kind of yoga and cannot use others. It doesn't make sense. We need all kinds of yoga. However, you have to understand a certain priority. I'd like to stress it again that in our school, the School of Ananda Swami tradition, yoga of higher love is the highest priority. However, it is inseparable from both Tantra Yoga and Yoga of the Union. Why are these three types of yoga inseparable? Let's try to answer this question not from the standpoint of the axiomatic macrocosm, but the standpoint of the axiomatic microcosm. We remember that each of us is made in the image and likeness of the Absolute and has certain internal structures. We have our higher self and our manifestations, our personal prana. Our manifestations is divided into its two extremes, the principle of energy and the principle of consciousness, or the principle of eternal modification and the principle of eternal permanence. These two principles appear from the same prana. After they get divided, they start interacting with each other again, but in a different way. As a result, they create something that is called our body. How exactly does our body get created? Consciousness and energy move away from each other despite originating from the same source. As they move away from each other, together they create certain centers or chakras. Consciousness and energy are present in each of them. However, the first center has brighter forms of consciousness and more subtle forms of energy. The one that is created last has rougher forms of energy and dimmer forms of consciousness. This is how the central channel of our body, as well as the system of chakras located along the central channel, get created according to the yoga axiomatics. Later on, the central channel, together with the chakra system, with the consciousness from one pole and energy from the other, begins to grow shells. The first shell that covers consciousness and energy is the causal body. What is the causal body? The causal body is consciousness and energy in an extremely subtle form. They form a certain analog of matter. Then the next shell of the subtle body gets formed. It is also consciousness and energy, but more pronounced than the causal body. Then a shell of our physical body is formed. What is our physical body? It is also consciousness and energy, but in their roughest forms. Everything we see, including our physical body, is energy or condensed matter penetrated with the rays of consciousness, which somehow shapes this matter. We are like nesting dolls made of three parts. But these three levels, the causal, subtle, and physical ones, are threaded on the central channel together with the chakra system. The central channel, in its turn, pierces the chakra system like a skewer pierces pieces of meat or vegetables. To make it clear from the very beginning, the central channel is a more serious and primal structure than all the chakras. The chakras are subordinate structures. The central channel is the main one. Thus, we have the central channel that pierces the chakras. Energy is on one side of the central channel, and consciousness is on the other side. All this gets clothed with a layer of causal, then subtle, and finally rough physical matter. That is how we get the bodies we are using right now to listen to this Yoga of Higher Love lecture. Thus, there is a clear correlation between our bodies and our energy at the base of our spine, our consciousness at the top of our head, and our chakras that are somewhere and somehow sort of geometrically aligned with our spine. Our causal, subtle, and physical bodies correlate with these subtle structures even more. That is how we get represented as people. Our soul or our higher self is outside of all this. It controls it, being the source of everything above. It controls our body. For sure, our bodies use other flows of energy from food or air that somehow pass through us. However, these energy flows are directed and controlled by our energy and consciousness coming from our higher self. The soul of each of us is sexless. Why? Because the level of our self is higher than the level of law, too. Our soul is sexless. In other words, you can be born a man in one life and a woman in other one.